And the caption reads, Shushan is protecting her friend. She's not letting the husband to beat up the wife. And there are also quite a lot of campaigns to stop child marriages. There is a lot of awareness rising around this as well. There is a lot of also articles written by doctors on women's reproductive rights, reproductive healthcare, not rights. And this is where we come to the issue of abortion, of reproductive rights. So we.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Other Armenias podcast. I'm your co-host, Mirena Abrahamian.
And I am your other co-host, Tamar Shirinyan.
So as always, please remember to subscribe, follow, like, share comments on our YouTube channel and all platforms where podcasts are available, Other Armenias. And Tamar will introduce our guests for today and the topic that we're going to be discussing.
So in honor of International Women's Day, we thought it would be great to have a conversation about international feminism, especially forms of feminism that exist beyond the West, that are not only non-Western because of location, but also not liberal, non-liberal forms of feminism. And Armenia is a great place to begin exploring some of those histories and those realities. Armenia was, for 7 decades, part of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had a long history of other forms of feminism, namely Bolshevik feminism, and which had its beginning and very kind of politically revolutionary moment, but it also had a long-lasting legacy throughout the Soviet era. We'll talk about some of those legacies today. We have with us Sona Baldryan, who is an independent feminist researcher who lives in Yerevan, Armenia, and who has a lot of experience working with feminist organizations, feminist non-governmental organizations in Armenia, and who's going to talk to us about this history of non-liberal feminism, as well as the way in which those histories have been silenced and forgotten for the most part, except for people like Sona Baldryan, who's continuing to look into these histories and their possibilities for today and going forward into the future. A few notes about the history of feminism in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had in the beginning, in fact, it was shut down quickly before even 2 decades. A thing called the women's departments, zhenotdel in Russian. And these were women's departments that would agitate around women's issues. Bolshevik feminists were very concerned about the relationship between gender and political economy or class, and were not content with advocating for women solely as women, separated from the class struggle, which they were also advocating for, and in fact saw women's inclusion into the class struggle as the only way for the class struggle to ultimately be successful. And so women's inclusion into the workplace, women's inclusion into revolutionary struggle, including agitation, including as writers, including as revolutionaries, was absolutely essential for the success of the revolution in the early years. One of the ways in which this comes to Armenia, just one of the ways, is a magazine that began publication very early on as Armenia became a Soviet Socialist Republic. A magazine entitled Հայաստանի աշխատավորուհի in Armenian, translated into English as Armenia's Woman Worker. So welcome, Sona. And can you please tell us about this magazine?
Thank you, Tamar, and thank you for the introduction. And thank you for saying that I'm one of the people that is, trying to remember and trying to not forget these histories. But I also want to say that the reason that I'm able to not forget is because of people like you who provide us with scholarship to understand the context, and people like Milena who have done a long activism before I even came to be an activist in Armenia in the women's rights movement, in the feminist movement. So I think it's also important to remember our references and the people who inspire us to continue remembering. So let's talk a little bit about what was Armenia's Woman Worker magazine. It started being published in 1924, and after like 8 years, the Soviet Union fell. Up until 1998, it continued to be published with very few resources. So it's a quite big database of Soviet Armenian women's history. If we look at the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, the histories that we find there are quite different. And the 20s are full of revolutionary optimism. We see how much the Soviets are trying to change the social norms around the traditional family. So the magazine had quite a lot of political articles and writings in it. I've also done some other research on other Armenian women's magazines, for example, from the Istanbul Armenian community. To be honest with you, it's not comparable to the level of political maturity that we often see in Armenia's Woman Worker. There is this constant also like push for women to get educated. There is this constant push for women to be engaged with literacy campaigns. There is this separate section in each issue. So it was issued every month. In each issue, there is this separate section on law, and it informs women on all the legal reforms that the Soviets were doing at the time. Like you had the right to divorce your husband, get an alimony, or things like that. And the imagery that you could also see there was that of an Armenian woman standing in front of a court and voicing her opinions. And you can constantly see in that magazine the Armenian woman being as the leader of her community. The imagery is portrayed in that way, and trying to, for example, fight against domestic violence. And she's like, I remember quite vividly one example of a small like image from the earlier years where a woman is standing between a man, a husband and a wife, I'm assuming. And the caption reads, Shushan is protecting her friend. She's not letting the husband to beat up the wife. And there are also quite a lot of campaigns to stop child marriages. There is a lot of like, awareness rising around this as well. There is a lot of also articles written by doctors on women's reproductive rights, reproductive healthcare, not rights. And this is where we come to the issue of abortion, of reproductive rights. So we all know that the Soviet Union was the first country in the history of the world to legalize abortion. And if you, in a lot of the issues in the Soviet, the Armenia's Woman Worker magazine, you can see like citations to Lenin's works and why that law was necessary. And in one of the articles that I have read, there was Lenin was saying that, well, women are being exploited in the family. They are being forced to have so many children, and there is no way for them to take care of these children. The state has basically failed social welfare. So what we need to do is step up and let women make that decision of, taking control of their own lives, and if they want to continue, if they want to go into the workforce, let them be introduced to the workforce instead of just being held in the family. This is an important thing that the Soviets are doing at this time. What they're doing is displacing the family patriarch and installing the state as the ultimate father. This also can be quite problematic if you think about it, but what they're in these early stages of like abortion legalization, the intention behind it wasn't that abortion is a good thing and women should all have access to this. This is like a healthcare, procedure, and women should have access to it. No, I think the intention, quite very obviously stated, was that until there is a well-developed socialist state, we cannot demand women to have as many children as we want them to have. So if we want women to have children, this is a very economic understanding of why women get abortions. If we want women to have children, we have to provide them with all the social welfare necessary, childcare, protection of pregnant women workers, or protection of mother workers and all that, right? Of nurseries, kindergartens, and all that social welfare system that requires we usually expect a child to have in a socialist context, possibly not in a very capitalist context. So until we have that, we cannot expect women to give birth to as many children as possible. And that, I think, was the weakest point of the law, and that allowed for it, for abortion to be banned in 1936 with the so-called Stalin Constitution. I think it also had these political reasons. At the time, the Soviets very much were understanding that there was going to be a war in the European continent, and they had to fight against Nazi Germany. So that pronatalism in banning abortion can be tied back to, military calculations. That's basically what I can say about like the 1920s and the 1930s. And then for a few years during the war, what I wanted to mention here is that a couple of years ago, when in the United States there were a lot of states, like one after another, were banning abortion, even there were these heartbeat laws, or like the 6-week abortion bans and all that. There was a very interesting article I read from a very liberal publication in the US. I think it was the LA Times or something. And it said what the US can learn from Stalin's abortion ban. It was a very sympathetic article to Stalin. And what it was arguing, it was that, yes, the Soviets banned abortion in 1936, but it also was done in a way that was pushing for more healthcare for women and children, for more childcare, for more rights for women workers. It was constantly pushing for social welfare for women, which is not something that the United States is doing currently. That was the whole point of the article. And I think that is the main difference that we have to remember, the difference between the Soviets banning abortion and then today, in today's context in the United States, politicians and policymakers banning abortion. That's the big difference between the two. Yeah.
So this is all fascinating, and I want to say a couple of things, one of which is a question for you. First, can you give our listeners a sense of what the Soviet Union, or what these republics that formed the Soviet Union at this time were like? Because we're talking about very early on. And when I say that history has kind of erased and forgotten this kind of feminism, including in this part of the world, right? I mean, so much goes on in Armenian feminism today, largely liberal feminism, to erase this part of history. But the Soviet women were the first women legally allowed to vote in the West. Or in the developed world. I mean, in any democracy, were the first women allowed to vote. the divorce laws that the Zhenotdel and the Bolshevik feminists passed very early on, I think beginning in 1917, were extremely liberal for women. And I mean liberal in the good way there. They were divorce laws that allowed quick divorces. They were no cause-based divorces. So women could decide they wanted to leave their husbands and do so. And without much bureaucratic process, in fact. This was in itself revolutionary. On top of which the Bolshevik feminists and Zhenotdel and the women's department really worked hard to establish daycare centers, to establish public canteens. And of course, they didn't get as far as they would have liked to. The aspiration really was to liberate all women from the home and into public work. And many women were, especially in urban centers. Many women did get access to daycare centers, were able to access food in canteens at places of work for their families so that they wouldn't have to stay home and cook. Public laundries, where laundry was done publicly as waged labor rather than women as unwaged working in the household. So these are pretty major works, major feminist achievements, but at a time of extreme chaos and in this part of the world, in the Soviet Union, that had undergone a terrible civil war that had killed many people for many years. And that was preparing for a new war where it would have to go to war with the developed Western European countries, perhaps, including Germany, of course, which was the major threat at the time from very early on. And it was developing. It was actually, this was not a developed capitalist, part of the world. It was very much in development. So, and in a closed system where the Soviets were really trying to get access to and produce steel, and coal and other things that were necessary for industrialization on a mass scale in order to be able to materialize, to militarize, to prepare for this massive war. So can you describe what that means for feminists to have these big aspirations in this context?
Yeah. When you were asking about like what it was like, I was reminded of one of the articles I read in Armenian Woman Worker. I think it was from 1925, 26. So it was about a mother who had to carry her son from outskirts of what we now call the city of Yerevan, Armenia's capital, from outskirts of Yerevan to the city center. She had to carry her son or her child, I don't remember the gender of the child, on her back to the center of the city in order for the child to get healthcare. That's how underdeveloped all of Armenia was. And we also have to remember that Armenia at the time was a country that was recovering from a genocide, that was recovering from wars, and it was the situation of Armenia was very unique, unlike other Soviet states. Not to take anything away from the sufferings of other Soviet peoples, but in terms of like the proportions for a very small country, Armenians went through a lot in that in those 10 or in those decades. I have heard some Armenian scholars describe what you were saying, the liberation of women, as forced. I've heard like there is this very like liberal agency and versus structures theory that I can't quite get behind, because I don't believe that agency is the only thing that should be considered under structures, but I'm also not the sort of person who considers the structures to be omnipotent. Like I understand that there is a certain level of agency, but to me, when you say that the Soviet campaigns for the liberation of women was forced and was performative, I think I think it's just an ideological thing, because in material reality, yes, a lot of things were changing for women. And they were changing for the better, because we should not forget that in the Soviet Union, when they started letting women, to be part of higher education, be part of, all these male-dominated fields, women quickly rose up the ranks. And in 1955, when the Soviet Union re-legalized abortion, it was largely done by the first woman healthcare minister of the Soviet Union, Maria Kovrigina, and a overwhelming majority of women doctors who were telling policymakers, the bureaucrats in the Soviet system, that women are dying as a result of underground abortions. And this is costing us 4,000 lives a year. So 4,000 women are dying annually, and our calculations are showing that forcing women to, banning abortion and forcing women to have children is not going to fix the post-war population problem the Soviets were facing. So we have to remember that rapid industrialization, rapid literacy campaigns, like I remember when I was a kid and we were studying the Soviet era, I was reading about 1920s, 1930s, and I was astonished back then to read that only like a very small percentage of Armenians could actually read and write in Armenian. And by 1930s, it was already like in the 90s. 90% of Armenians could already read and write. That's a huge achievement. That shows that the Soviets weren't just committed to, the more masculine ideas of economy, industrialization, but also to the very important social context, like educating people. And when women got educated, that also helped them to send notes and letters to the Armenian Woman Worker magazine, telling on their male comrades, telling on them, saying like, okay, this person in my town is always talking about communism and socialism and equality, but in reality, he's always beating his wife. And we all know about it, and the whole town knows about it. I read one of those, and I was like astonished that they actually published this. Whether it is like in this era of purges, everyone is just like very angry, and that's also, the purges aren't just, from above, they're also very much a grassroots movement, and whether it is, also informed by that, but the reality is they are given a platform to voice their concerns, and women are saying, stop, domestic violence, and we are against this. We want men to not be hypocrites, and to actually follow through with their rhetoric. This is like the reality, I think, a lot of the times people are forgetting when they are talking about the Soviet Union, and just the rapid industrialization, the rapid housing provision, and the rapid everything. Like it is astonishing just how much they have been able to accomplish. Because when I was studying one of the industrial neighborhoods in Yerevan, I was just like astonished just how much of that one single street is representative of Armenia's neoliberal transformations. Like there is, for example, polyclinic. These are state-run facilities from the Soviet era that are just like the primary care places for people to go to get like their everyday healthcare needs, to get them taken care of. This one of these polyclinics had I don't know, 3 or 4 story, like they had many buildings, but these buildings have been sold to private enterprises, and they have been privatized and given to NGOs. And I was very, very like stunned to find out that one of those NGOs works with the EU and USAID to ensure that there is a free market and free in Armenia there is a good investment environment, and where investors feel confident in the Armenian markets. I was like, this is like literally they've taken away what used to be once for the workers of that industrial neighborhood, because the workers were the ones who needed in the the primary care. They have taken this from the workers, sold it for whatever, with whatever ways, because I don't think that was very much a legal process, because they didn't have the right to do that. They've sold it to somebody else, and now that building serves a completely different purpose. That's how much the space has completely changed. And that, to me, those like literal things are very important. And when people say, okay, the Soviets didn't manage to topple the patriarchy, or like there was also social conservatism in the Soviet Union. Yes, there was. Absolutely. When you read Armenia's Woman Worker magazine, especially when you look at the March 8 issues of each year, starting from the 60s, you can see just how socially conservative everything is getting in there. There is a specific type of woman that the magazine is catering to, and there is very much an emphasis on this morality that a young woman and young girls have to follow to be proper women that are deserving of good marriage and good children. And I remember one of them had this quiz about how much of a good woman you are, and I took the quiz, and turns out I'm not very but sometimes when I was reading it, I could like see where my mom, for example, was coming from. That rhetoric, everything, the ideology that I myself have had to live with. I could clearly see where this was developed, and I'm not denying that March 8 had a very important role in the magazine, and they, curated a lot of stories, especially dedicated to, internationalism. And this magazine is never like just about curating a special, like a woman for the private sphere. It's not just about that. It's not just like, it also informs women of the public life. It informs them of, like, for example, the Vietnam War, informs the invasion of Afghanistan, everything like that. There is like, it doesn't shy away from things like that, but it's also like very heavy on promoting certain gender stereotypes, and like how well everyone should be cooking. And there is like very
Sona, do you think that's a Soviet thing or an Armenian thing? Do you know of, can you compare to others? Yeah.
I don't think it's an Armenian thing, but yeah, I don't think it's an Armenian thing. I think it's a Soviet thing. Yeah, there is a very specific Soviet obsession, especially with French culture. I'm not gonna lie to you, with French cuisine, with French fashion, with there is like a very specific Russian obsession that is translated into the Armenian context as well. And I find this social conditioning of women to be one of the reasons why it was so easy to take away women's rights after the fall of the Soviet Union. And what I mean by this is that when women are constantly conditioned to think of themselves as the ones looking from the private sphere to the outside, and maybe that's a specifically Armenian thing, maybe that doesn't necessarily, for example, refer to Soviet Russia. Maybe that comes from the Armenian culture, where women are required to be inside a family and constantly undervalue their own understanding of politics and the public sphere. And when you condition women to be accepting of their secondary status, that also makes it easier for very nationalist, militarist, and neoliberal or just liberal politicians to take away their rights with the capitalist restructuring that they have done in the 90s. When the 90s came and Armenia was facing an energy crisis, was facing the earthquake, the aftermath of the earthquake, and also the violent conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh with Azerbaijan, the industry completely collapsed. Like 90% of the industry in Armenia wasn't working. And a lot of women lost their jobs. It was very hard for them to take care of the family because there was no electricity, nothing. And the mother worker model was no longer there. And a very, very, very sad photo I remember from Armenia's woman worker. It's cover photo, I think from 1989. It is right after the earthquake in Spitak that has completely destroyed northern Armenia, left 25,000 people dead and 500,000 people homeless. The Prime Minister of the UK, Margaret Thatcher, comes to Armenia and she's welcomed to Armenia with this people are very enthusiastic about it. And you can see how much people, crave for this Western validation from this woman and what she represents. And because at the time, Armenians were also blaming the Soviets for the earthquake, for the poor quality of the buildings. And also there was this conspiracy that the Russians orchestrated an earthquake to punish Armenians for activism over Nagorno-Karabakh, which is completely made up, and you can't really orchestrate an earthquake. But the fact that there was an issue with the poor quality of the buildings is a real issue, and I think that was an issue that they took up with the Soviets. But also is it the fault of the Soviets or the people who were constructing it? But yeah, you see the 90s are a time where these neo-familialist policies are being introduced, both in Armenia and everywhere in the post-Soviet space. This is something I have learned from the Russian context, and I sort of translated into the Armenian context from Russian scholars. These neo-familialist policies are policies that sort of give women the incentive to stay home, to not work because there is not enough, labor. There are not enough jobs in the labor market, and companies are forced to cut down on their women workers because the Soviets had so many provisions for protecting these women that the women are becoming very costly workers, and the provision of different social safety measures and all that was becoming quite expensive. So it was much easier to get rid of all the women. So the capitalist class got rid of the women, and the political elites decided to just give women some benefits, but benefits so that they would stay home. And in this context, it's important to remember that in modern Armenia, the historical context around March 8 has completely collapsed. So if you would, I'm criticizing the Soviet era magazine for, not being feminist enough, right? Let's say, from the 60s and especially in the 80s, right? But someone who grew up at that time would know every single one of the people who were responsible for March 8 to become this huge day for women internationally everywhere. They wouldn't, not know who, for example, Clara Zetkin was, if you ask them. Even if they were not someone who was quite, highly educated. This was part of the everyday discourse, part of everyday political life. But now March 8 has been commercialized so much that the whole political context and the historical context around it has completely collapsed, to a point that right now we also have April 7th, the Motherhood and Beauty Day. This is a literal translation from Armenian, the Motherhood and Beauty Day, that sort of serves as a bookend for the Women's Month that starts on March 8th and ends on April 7th. And April 7th was introduced in 1995. It has a very much Christian, there's a very much religious background to it. It is, there to commemorate the day of Annunciation, when Virgin Mary became informed that she was going to have, God's son, Jesus Christ. So you can see that we can criticize the Soviet era but for all its faults, it's not comparable to the absolute cruelty, disregard with which women have been socially and economically and politically displaced in Armenian public life. And then this displacement occurs, and then the human rights-based development projects come into Armenia, and the biggest donor is USAID in the early 2000s. And they understand that, well, women are in need of saving. and it's as if, and what the thing about development projects is that the only way you can work in it is if you pretend that you're a goldfish who doesn't remember what they have done before. You're constantly doing the same thing over and over again, doing the same, evaluations and the same measurements and the same things for the past 30 years. And that's the thing about it, that in a lot of these discourses today, in liberal feminist discourses, I see that there is an emphasis on resilience, for the system to be reordered to function as it was supposed to function, instead of reordering the system. It is just giving women enough to not create any ruptures and uprisings against it. And that's why resilience can never be resistance. And that's why, in this context today, March 8th has completely, and, a few years ago, we did an interview, and I refrained from, talking critically about the women's NGOs here and the role that they play in devaluing March 8th. But I think it's quite obvious, and, doesn't necessarily need huge academic or, I don't know, vocabulary to describe what's going on with the way that March 8th is being completely erased as the day that women's rights should be, at the center of advocacy and activism. Which, for example, 10 or 15 years ago, it wasn't like that. There was still at least some level of anti-government, anti-state grassroots activism happening around the NGOs that the NGOs were supporting as well. But now that we have a more liberal government, that has completely shifted, and that has completely died down, and there is this domination of NGOs over discourses relating to Armenian workers, Armenian women, what it means to be a worker and what it means to be labor, care, everything is defined by hegemonic structures, which is very sad. Yeah, of course.
Armenia's woman worker was published up until 1996, is it, or 1994?
1998.
1998. Can you talk a little bit about how the magazine itself had these different parts to it, right? So there were parts where people could share their letters, ask for advice, and all of those things. And then there were beauty tips. There were models for sewing your own clothes, I think, too. There were recipes, instructions on how to I know very early on, how to bathe children properly and how to do these. Can you talk about how these different sections and the general overall political messaging changed from 1991, or maybe even the late 1980s to 1998 for the last issue?
So the issue of 1991 that was published in the October already has a change in the name of the street on which the magazine was being published. So it was being published at the press building that had its own publishing house, and the street was at the time called Orjonikidze. It was named after this Georgian communist, Sergo Orjonikidze, and they changed the street's name to Arshakunyats. And Arshakunyats, when nation goes through a very deeply painful economic restructuring, it also needs to sort of reframe its own history. And then you need to be reminded of your own great dynasties and your own great kingdoms and all that. So that, I think renaming it to Ashakunyat was a way for Armenians to remember how great they once were under under the dynasty of Ashakunyats in the from the first to third or fourth centuries, third to fourth centuries. My Armenian history knowledge has completely deteriorated. Sorry. Yeah. So when this shift happens, the names of the streets are changed, and there is this reframing of history based on Christian nationalist and all that, all those values. A lot of funny things happen. For example, another street that connects Ashakunyats to one of the largest squares in Yerevan is called, they renamed it after Garegin Nezhdeh. And the street connects it to Suren the square where Suren Spandaryan's, who was a Bolshevik revolutionary, statue is still there. It still stands there. When I was a kid, and I would my parents would take me there, and my grandparents lived there, and whenever we would visit my grandparents, I would just ask my dad and my mom, why is this square named after Garegin Nezhdeh, but the statue is completely another person? Why isn't this guy Garegin Nezhdeh? I would constantly ask my parents, and they would never have an answer for this. This is a very, I think you in your book, Tamar, you call this disorganized abandonment, where a lot of the things are changing, and they are changing very rapidly in a very disorganized manner. And in the Armenian Woman Worker magazine, you can also see this, the way that the Armenian women's intelligentsia is taking it on themselves to promote nationalist narratives on behalf of the Armenian state. And that was so similar to the writings I have seen from the Istanbul Armenian women's magazines, and the way that they were talking about the Armenian community in relation to the Turkish state, and the genocidal Turkish state, and all the denialism around it. There is some reporting done on environmental struggles from 1991, 1992. There is a lot of the blame is on the Soviet authorities for poisoning Armenia's Yerevan's air and all that. And this is also accelerating the deindustrialization process that Armenia is going through. From the magazine, I can also remember, as I said, there is the cover photo with Margaret Thatcher, and I've also done interviews with people from Gyumri, so there is this school there called the English School, and the teachers from there who I interviewed were very proud of the fact that Margaret Thatcher has visited their school, and they're very there's this sort of excitement around it. It's astonishing to see how people are conditioned to accept their own dispossession, their own devwelfarization, and how all those processes become apolitical. People do not understand it as part of politics. The state is bad. It does nothing for us, right? As we say, the country is not a country. But for the longest time, up until 2018, when this social movements all of a sudden started happening in Armenia, up until that point, a lot of the social movements, labor struggles in Armenia have been silenced. Specifically, there has been this attempt at promoting any sort of demand from the state to fix issues, to promote the social, to promote social welfare, to the welfare state. There has been this very concerted effort by the state to ridicule people and politicians and public intellectuals for even attempting to suggest that emotional model of government that the Soviets had. Even today, you can see from our own current government just how much ridicule ridiculed, literally people being humiliated for even suggesting a neoliberal governance is probably not right for a country like Armenia, and neoliberalism is not the solution to a lot of the problems that Armenians are facing today. Like, yeah, for example, there was this statue of the worker on the Arshakuniats Avenue that was stolen in 1997. And it was just stolen because people needed to sell the metal parts, you know? It was just that. I don't think it had anything to do with anti-Soviet memory politics. But at the time, the city hall was just like, it's not, it's as important for us as a stone on the side of the road. Like, it's not culturally significant for us to be, you know, thinking about it. But now the Armenian government is saying, oh, we are going to restore the statue. We're going to restore it, and we are going to spend over almost $200,000 on it. Why? You have to ask yourself, why? When they are doing everything they can to socially displace the same workers the statue is supposed to represent. Like, we talked about it like the last time with the biggest mining strike, with the biggest labor strike happened in Armenia's history, and how the government responded to it. And currently there is another minor strike in Armenia. It has been going over for a month, and again, the government is not doing anything about it. So who is it supposed to represent? And this is what I want, you know, this is where I'm going. Like, it's so depoliticized. Everything is so depoliticized. So the government can just like spend some money on some symbolic things like the statue of the worker. But that statue has completely, again, lost all its meaning. Like the statue, like the, you know, March 8th day, like another statue on that same avenue of Shushanik Gurginyan, who was like a very popular Soviet era revolutionary poet. All these statues have lost their meanings. It's just like you know, in the British Museum, like where they have stolen artifacts from different countries and just like collected them and put them there, and then people just see, oh, that's there. Yeah, sure. But it completely has been taken out of its context. It's the same thing to me. Like that's the same thing. Like, there is no connection to its historical roots. And if you even attempt to do that, there is like all sorts of movements in Armenia, whether they're right-wing or liberal, that will try to silence you and try to silence anyone that dares to what they call have Soviet nostalgia.
I have something. I just want to kind of go back to something that you said about when abortion was made illegal in the Soviet times and then made legal again, and sort of the way that worked. And you said that taking away this, I guess, I don't remember if this is exactly your words, just kind of how I remember, like the father figure kind of becomes like, you take it away from the, I guess, the family sphere, and you put it on the state level. And I mean, in a way, a state is patriarchal, and like, you know, even if it's the Soviet state, right? And so when you came to the 90s and you were talking about Margaret Thatcher visiting this English school in Gyumri, and this woman, you know, kind of the way that she had kind of interpreted that, or how the effect that it had on her, and you spoke about how, you know, how can people be so you know, it's like in a way, like, if not even paying attention to so much to their dispossession. And I'm wondering, you know, I'm not wondering, I think that does have to, that is also all of the things you're mentioning about the workers and everything, like all of the Soviet legacy that we think is really amazing. I do think that there's also a Soviet legacy of this way of thinking about yourself. And I will explain what I mean. I think I always, you know, like my generation is the generation that was born in Armenia. Like, I was born in the Soviet Union, and then I was growing up when the Soviet Union had collapsed, and in this kind of like chaos that we were living in the 90s in a way, right? Also a space of possibility where, things could have, things could have gone differently, maybe. But what I'm trying to say is, yeah, it's very late, and so my brain is a bit all over the place, but I have a point. Yeah, about how, so when I think about sort of the way that the systems under which, and the collapses under which I've come into my socialization, right? And then like the systems in which my parents lived as boomers, where in the Soviet, like, sort of reality, like there were a lot of things that were just in a way, I mean, I understand that they were workers and working, and so it wasn't like it was just handed to them, but in a way they were taken care of by the state, whereas my generation is not taken, we're still not taken care of by the state. And then how maybe you get used to that, and then that's maybe there's a nostalgia that people have that comes from that generation. But I think part of it is this kind of thing of accepting or being so susceptible to actually, being not sort of fighting against liberalism, let's say. Because I would say that, okay, why did people who had all of this benefits and all of the were living in sort of more security in a way, why wouldn't you fight because it's being taken away from you? It's because I think you are waiting for someone else to give you something. I'm sorry. So yeah, I have a lot of rage when it comes to the generation before me. I'm sure like the next generation might have a lot of rage towards me, although I don't know why they would like. So I just wanted to point that out as well, so that the Soviet legacy is not just, it's to complicate it a bit more. For the sake of, I'm in favor, for the sake of some kind of justice in how we present these things.
And that's a really good point, right? The kind of taken for grantedness of not just all of the social benefits that came, as part of the Soviet Union. We talked about how that changed, and there was a lot of social conservatism. And Sona, you talked about the ways in which that happened throughout the Soviet decades, starting in the 1930s. I mean, Stalin did like a 180, right, on some of the revolutionary liberation, imaginaries with that Bolshevik feminists and others, right, came up with in the 1910s and 1920s. But these had legacies, right? So we see the protection of abortion as, after the 1950s. We see the general equality between women and men economically in the Soviet Union that we don't see in other parts of the world, especially in the United States and in Western Europe. We see the literacy rates, education rates that are high and maintain high for a long time. And I think like one of the things that we often forget is the ways in which a lot of my friends in Armenia will joke of like, oh yeah, like my aunt was a surgeon. Everyone's aunt in the Soviet Union was a surgeon or an engineer, right? In what other world do you see that, right? Like, I mean, so many of my friends have aunts who are or were surgeons and engineers. And that's not a thing. That's not a thing in the United States. I mean, something that I often tell my students is like, think about how many women surgeons you know, right? And it's just like not comparable even today, let alone in like by the 1970s and 1980s when this was a reality in the Soviet Union. And so there were these legacies of Well, of course. Well, of course, like women are going to have equal access. And in fact, in some professions, affirmative action measures to protect to protect them and their entry into some forms of education in some institutions for work. And that became taken for granted. And all of those achievements that were begotten under the Soviet Union, even through this state paternalism and this taken for grantedness that came by the 1980s, what have post-socialist feminists in this part of the world been able to achieve? Since then, in fact, we have seen a massive decline in many of these realities, a massive decline in women's education, a massive decline in women entering into certain professions, including the medical profession. We've seen the massive decline in women's income, right? And in women are working. Women, contribute economically to their families, but women make far less than men do, even in the same job in the Soviet Union now, which was not necessarily the reality in the Soviet Union. It took over 15 years to get a domestic violence bill passed, right? And even at that point, right, when the international community is celebrating entry into Istanbul Convention, Armenia rejected entry into that convention. And so the very basic thing that was outlawed in the Soviet Union, although I'm not denying that domestic violence, occurred, of course, in the Soviet Union, but the very basic thing that, hey, beating your wife, not cool, not okay. And now you have Armenians struggling to not pass a law that forbids domestic violence. Right? It's like a backward slide that came out of this like taken for grantedness. Well, of course women have these rights. Of course.
So when I was interviewing my mother for this research that I was doing about her industrial, so Arshakunyat's Avenue is where my mother grew up. I would often notice that she, as feminist oral historians always argue, that when you interview women, they often give you two sorts of answers. One answer is according to the moral customs of the time, like that they think that they're supposed to give you, and one answer is according to their own lived experiences and their own feelings that they might not even be able to articulate, because of this thing called hermeneutical injustice. Like they don't have the specific words to articulate what's happening to them. So for example, like something like workplace sexual harassment. A lot of the times, women didn't have the vocabulary to talk about it. I felt like my mom also had like this double consciousness of a Soviet and a post-Soviet woman. As a Soviet woman, she believed that there should be free education, there should be free healthcare. The buses and the tramways and all this public transportation has to be very cheap. There have to be jobs available everywhere. Like you can just walk into a cold, then just walk into a factory and say, I need a job, and then you can get a job there. People in this era have these, beliefs, but that they have been told are too emotional, are from a system that no longer exists and is not there to protect them. And, especially for women, it's so much easier to accept because they're, they don't think that their political opinions matter. You can always, especially from lower class women, when you talk to them, they always devalue their self narratives. They always say, oh, my father was the one who was interested in politics. My father understood the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. I really, my brother and my father, I don't really understand that. That's not something a woman should be interested in. Yeah. But that's the thing about like, oh, Kani Hishelem, as we say in Armenian. A few days ago, I saw a interview between two Armenian public intellectuals who were talking about Armenian identity. And something like struck me in that conversation that I still can't get it out of my mind. Can get it out of my head. So one of the interviewee said, the only real Soviets that exist in Armenia today are the people who were dissidents of the Soviet Union, the people who were against the Soviet system. And that just struck me. I was like, I don't think that's true. I think the workers that were displaced, whose lives were turned upside down by the fall of the Soviet welfare system, were actually the ones who were the real Soviets. Because even in the Soviet Union, these were the people whose labor sustained the Soviet Union. It wasn't the public intellectual, I think in the Soviet Union, they gave too much credit to the intelligentsia class. And they were, their noses were too high, and they thought of themselves as too important. There's too much self-importance, attached to that identity that this is completely, foreign to me, because I feel like just like it's their way of this, like these people who still get to shape public policy and public like not even policy, public discourse about the Soviet Union. It's their way of once again establishing their authority over what our narratives of the Soviet Union should be like. It's like, oh, the workers, they didn't really these people are lower classes. They don't really understand what they were doing in the Soviet Union. They would just go to work all day, and they would just sometimes also steal from work. And there would be all these networks where they would sell the stuff that they have stolen from the factories. These are not people who really understand what the Soviet system really was.
And also that any good memories that these people have about the Soviet Union is just nostalgia, right?
Yeah.
The nostalgia dismissal drives me insane because when we're talking about like having food, having a job, having a home, and having access to education, you can talk about nostalgia and the grass is greener on the other side as much as you want. Those are concrete material realities that once existed and do not exist now. That's not a question, like it's not even about what people think about it. Objectively, it is good to have access to a home, food, work, and education and healthcare. Objectively, those are facts. Whether or not people remember it good or bad, those are objective facts that a system that allows those things is better than a system that does not allow those things. I wanted to say
why they created that. Sorry, but you see why they created that way of speaking about it, because it comes down to sort of like who's the loser and who's the winner in the Cold War, basically. So the winner gets to tell you that your whole world is just like completely like worth nothing, to the extent that, I'm sorry, I know that you wanted to say something, Tamar, but when you were talking about the surgeons and the engineers, like I can tell you that the fact that if you were a surgeon or an engineer and you end up in a Western country as an immigrant, like that has no value whatsoever. And you have to go and study all over again just so because Soviet medicine gets devalued, everything that is coming, because this is the loser. So it's so easy, like not, just to put your whole world and your memories and your like lived reality and your history, completely devalue it and say that, oh, what's that? It's very like, yeah. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I think it's important, this part.
No, I mean that narrative is very powerful, right? The dismissal of like, yeah, of course. And the one, about the doctors and surgeons, engineers and whatever is that, yeah, but what kind of surgeons were those? What kind of engineering was that? They were poorly educated. They didn't know what they were doing. And, like all of these kinds of, my father repeats this stuff all the time. And it's like, no, I mean, objectively, people had more access to healthcare, even if they didn't have the insane fancy technologies that the West at the time had, people had access. Like people might feel okay, it might be better to have access to medicine at all than to have access, if you're really rich, to really, really fancy technologies that no one has access to in the West anyway, even at that time. The one piece about dissidence that I wanted to talk about is I think that's a really important point because I mean, what you say, Sona, is like totally true, and I agree with that. But there is this other dimension about dissidence. We often hear about, well, you know, there were a lot of people against the Soviet Union. There were a lot of people who were like afraid to speak in the Soviet Union, and you know that they were like they wanted liberalism and democracy and things that they didn't have. And women were never. That was not feminism because women, you know, there's the double burden. Women had to work, but they also had to do all of the housework and all of this stuff. And it's like it often gets used to make it seem as if people were all really unhappy and wanted the collapse of the Soviet Union. Whereas
Yes.
in reality, the dissidents were true communists. And in fact, all of that complaint, all of the even the human rights activism and all of that was often pushing the Soviet Union to the left, right? To the left, not to the right. No one was advocating for neoliberalism, certainly. And then the whole like critique of Bolshevik feminism and even state paternalism that we get often within Western academic scholarship, feminist scholarship, is the idea that like yes, it seems as if there were all these affirmative action programs that made women's lives better, but in reality now women had to work and they had to take care of children and it was terrible. Excuse me, was that not happening? Was that not happening in Western Europe and the United States? And
That's
far
exactly what
worse
I was
because there was
saying.
no affirmative action for anyone's career at all.
Or like in Germany, you had to, you know, until the 70s in Western Germany, you had to have your husband's permission to have a bank account. You know, the level of advancement that Eastern Germany had over Western Germany, those are two, you know, different countries with the same people, you know, with the, you know, German traditions and all that. If you want to have a, you know, comparative study of the two. How come all these Eastern German women were much more, you know, socially liberated than the ones in Western Germany? How come the Soviets re-legalized abortion even before everyone in the West thought of, you know, giving some sort of abortion rights to their women? And like, you know, that's the thing that I often struggle with a lot of the times understanding. So I also want to mention just very briefly that a few years ago, me and a couple of my feminist comrades, we were so inspired by this Armenia's Woman Worker magazine. I think at the time I was very frustrated and quite like unhappy with my NGO work that I was doing. And I wanted to do really something like that I could be proud of. I wanted to do something that mattered. I really wanted to do this like socialist feminist manifesto in Armenian for Armenian audiences, for Armenian, especially young girls and women who wanted to have some, you know, elementary level of understanding of what socialist feminism was, like not that advanced, but like just like an introduction, because it's because there is so much negativity surrounding it. I just wanted for people to just have some sort of positive feelings towards it. So we started working in, at the time I was working for a women's rights NGO, and we got, you know, it was in the frameworks of a project that I was doing. And as the time went on and as we were doing it, and as I was editing all the articles and as I was putting together all the photos and the imagery and everything, I realized that I was giving up a lot of a lot of my own like very radical feminist and very socialist understandings of things, and I was just like trying to find a common language that I could use that was NGO but also like a bit radical, so that at least people were familiar and at least I was allowed to publish this magazine. And when we published it, a few days later, this in 2023, a few days later, this very short war began between Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijan. Then, and in the weeks after that, Nagorno-Karabakh was completely ethnically cleansed by Azerbaijan, and no one was left there. 100,000 people left there. So it was a very hard time for me. And I was, overcome with grief and feelings of guilt. Like, what am I even doing? Like, people are suffering, their material conditions are worsening, and I'm just like constantly talking about these ideas and getting paid to do that. And I felt really guilty. And I decided that I was not going to work on a second issue of this. For a very long time, I was not even able to open and just go through the magazine because I felt really guilty about it. And then my former workplace decided to go ahead and do another issue of it. And never asking me, never because I was the one who came up with the idea. I was actually the one who was a very, dedicated socialist feminist who really wanted to do socialist feminism. So it was, to my surprise, I was like, why the sudden interest? Because it was made very clear to me what we were doing was not socialist feminism. So I was very surprised that they were continuing to do that, and then very also disappointed to see that my very public calls to have a discussion about the way that they had decided to proceed with this magazine and the way that they decided to frame a lot of the stories in it, whether it was about working class, labor, care, the history of labor struggles in Armenia, heterosexuality, the patriarchal family. There was no willingness to have a moment of accountability, maybe. And that was quite I don't know. I can't say it was disappointing because I can't say I didn't expect it. But also, you do expect feminists, even liberal ones, to have a level of dedication to the people that they claim to represent, whether it is the working class women or whether it is the, I don't know, different identities of women that the NGOs constantly come up with.
But also for a magazine that takes its legacy from Armenia's woman worker,
Yeah.
you would expect some respect for labor, some respect for that labor.
For someone's intellectual labor, for someone's feminist labor, even. And yeah, it was, I don't know,
You
to
had
me,
to copyright your idea, Sona.
yes, in a capitalist
Sorry,
society,
under liberal
yeah,
like
yes, you can't
world
really
order and
expect.
context, even NGOs are also working with a corporate model.
Yeah,
Sorry to
yeah,
say.
yeah. It was very like, okay, I guess this is what we're doing now. I guess like you're spending a lot of money on something that you probably shouldn't be doing because you yourself have so many times publicly claimed that you're not interested in, like neoliberalism, Marxism, radicalism. And it is hard not to see conspiracy here. It is hard not to see, um, just like petty personal vendetta. And I think the reason I decided to speak up against it was also because I was reminded of reading all these magazines from the 20s, from Istanbul Armenian community, from the Yerevan, women's rights advocates and all that. And there was constant, back and forth between a lot of these people. So I wanted for there to be like a public documentation of this event so that 100 years later, when a researcher like me decides to go through this period and finds this magazine that some organization did in the 2020s and decides to understand the historical context of it, I felt like I had the obligation as the one who actually gave the NGO the model to co-opt this socialist magazine. I had the obligation to, first of all, have a moment of accountability for myself, public accountability, and tell people that, I'm very regretful about this. And also show that there is still authentic feminist discourse happening in Armenia, despite all the financial struggles that those of us who live in the margins of this feminist civil society are forced to go through. Yeah.
Should we close off here?
Yeah.
Good.
I just want to say that I think it gives me a lot of strength to know that you are part of the kind of network and collective of people, Sona, who are doing feminist thinking and practice and making it a key component of how you move through the world, move through the context in Armenia. And that makes me feel like we're always going to win against these kind of liberal systems. And I have no doubt that we are constantly winning in it, and not to put like a value of winning is, but it's important, I think, for us to not feel defeated in order to continue, because I think that's part of the thing, is to kind of make us feel defeated. And that's what the the capitalist system does and did, and made people feel and constantly makes people feel defeated. And it's a lot of hard work, dedication, and love. Our past last episode was about love, revolutionary love, that makes it possible for us not to feel defeated. So I just wanted to end on that note. This was the Other Armenia's podcast. This is our March 8th our episode dedicated to March 8th. As always, subscribe, follow, make comments. Tell us what you're doing on March 8th, what your plans are.
Thank you, Sona, for speaking with us. Thank you to our listeners. And we hope you will tune in again.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.